Well, good afternoon, everybody. There's a lot of everybody's out here who's not usually here. You're new everybody's. And so I'm going to apologize up front because I just spoke 2 weeks ago and then got moved to today due to someone else not being here. And I'm thinking, how do I do another topic right away? What if I reuse part of my previous message and do part 2? So if you weren't here, you should have been. It was fantastic. It was the best sermon that you ever would have heard. That's on you. You should have. That was your fault. So, by way of introduction, then, since I probably should do that, we had the pleasure of going to Italy for the feast, but afterwards did a side trip to Greece, and had a pretty momentous day going to Athens and spending time, as you see here, on the Parthenon. But for those who weren't here, that small piece of rock in front of it is Mars Hill. And in Acts 17, we have this wonderful message where Paul, coming into the city of Athens, gets called upon after talking to many other brethren, goes to Mars Hill and preaches. Some would say defends himself in front of this group called the Areopagus, which was a quasi-religious governmental agency, and does his defense and gives this wonderful sermon where he preaches to the unknown God. And he's standing here, and I think it was interesting to see when I went there to try to show, as you stand up on the Parthenon, you see the Mars Hill is just down below it. It is this, this is all on an elevated part looking over the entire city, but he would have given this defense, this indictment, and this message in front of the most dominating piece of architecture in the entire region that was revered by this group of people as the God that they worshipped, who the city was named after. And he would have stood there and he tells them basically of this God they don't worship. And let's turn, if you will, let's go to Acts 17. Because what I want to do today, my message last 2 weeks ago was titled, Paul's message on Mars Hill. Today I'm going to give the prequel. If you're a Star Wars fan, this is the prequel to the actual messages. We're going to give, how did Paul get to this moment? But let's start by going to Acts 17. Because I made a slight reference as he was standing here. So how does the road look like to get to this message? And in Acts 17, right after he proclaims to these individuals, to the unknown God, he says in verse 24, God who made the world and everything in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. That's the message. He's standing here in front of a temple that they thought referenced Athena, the city of Athens is named after, and he says, your God does not live here. I'm here to tell you about the God you don't know. You have temples all over the place to so many different gods, but I'm here to tell you about the unknown God who does not live in this massive building behind me. But the interesting thing about that indictment, that message he said, is those were not his words. Those were Stephen's words. So if we're going to talk about how does Paul get here to Acts 17:24, when he gives this message, let's start back at the beginning, and let's go back to where he got that from, because I think it makes it more powerful in understanding who Paul was and where he got there. So let's go back to Acts 7, because when he said those words, he's quoting Stephen, who in Acts 7, as we all know, is doing something very similar. He's giving a sermon, a very long one, a much longer one than Paul gives, standing in front of a temple that is just as revered by the people that it was in front of. I would say the temple in Jerusalem, where the individuals there, in front of the Sanhedrin, would have viewed that temple as housing the God of their people. And Stephen was standing there just like Paul did all these years later. And let's start in verse 48, because Stephen, I'm not going to go through all of it because it's a very long message, kind of goes through and recounting a lot of history of the Jewish people and the things behind them. He's kind of like weaving a story of their history. And he comes down to verse 48 and says, however, the Most High does not dwell in temples made with hands, as the prophet says. And he goes on to quote Isaiah. He comes down in his indictment and tells them, our God is not in this temple here anymore either. Jesus Christ has come, he has died, he has risen, and it is a new age. And God does not dwell in this temple any longer. He now dwells inside of us. And we are that manifestation of that. And in the church going forward, it's a new time. And as we know, as he goes down to verse 51 here, and he gives them this rousing indictment, like a court scene, where it says, you stiff-necked and uncircumcised in heart and ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. As your fathers did so, which of the prophets did your fathers not persecute? And they killed those who foretold the coming of the just one, of whom you now have come and betrayed and are murderers, and who have received the law by the direction of the angels and have not kept it. Stephen gives this wonderful sermon kind of talking about the times, and then he just hammers them at the end. He says, this is not where God dwells, and you have not been good followers of it anyways. And we know, how does that go? How does that sit with them? We know it very clearly. We can bump over to verse 58 here as we're trying to track down this history of how do we get from this message here to Paul's message in front of these people in Athens. In verse 58 here it says, and they cast him out, they take Stephen out, they stone him. And it says, and Stephen was calling on God saying, in verse 58, and they cast him out of the city and stoned him, and the witnesses laid down their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. We see this is the first occurrence of Saul coming on the scene. He's present. He would have heard that message, and he was instrumental in the killing of Stephen as part of it. He gets his start here. It's his origin story, if we're going to mix metaphors with as many science fiction things as I can here today. So Saul is at this moment, and he sees the reaction to the people. He sees the reaction of how this happens, and he's probably proud of himself for what he does. And they kill Stephen. But if we drop down into verse 1 of chapter 8, and the story continues on, it says, now Saul was consenting to his death. He was part of it. He was part of this action, this mob that comes forward. And at that time, a great persecution arose within the church, which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea and Samaria, except the apostles. There's a lot there in that first verse. We know Paul is part of it. Well, Saul. Sorry, I have a hard time always kind of going back to his previous name. So Saul is there, he's consenting, and this great persecution begins. And it's terrible. But what does it say it did? It had an unintended consequence. It says that persecution arose and it scattered the people to the regions, except the apostles stay, but it starts this mass exodus, this spread to new areas, probably more rural areas, getting out of the cities. And what do those people take with them? Their newfangled ideas, don't they? They take their message that they had heard, that Stephen had just preached to them, that they heard from Christ all these years, that they heard on the Temple Mount as Peter gave his rousing sermon in Acts 2 and 3. They take these messages and it's spread to all these areas. It listens to the regions of Judea and Samaria. If we drop down into just as a quick example, we see in verse 5, it says, we have the story of Philip. It says that Philip went down into Samaria and preached Christ to them. The actions of that day, this persecution that happened, that Saul led the charge of, helped spread the word. It helped put this into new areas. Samaria, as Philip does here, is a perfect example. It's kind of a bridge city, if you will. Half Jewish, half Gentile, people that had a little bit of a mix there. It's a perfect area to start taking this message to a people that would have had some sort of inkling towards it. And we see this persecution that Saul was perpetuating helped start the spread. And what do we read about through the entire whole book of Acts then is this, the story of that spread. And as we know then, Saul will go through his transition, his conversion, as he then becomes Paul, and he becomes a part of it. And so when we come down into verse 1 here, out of verse 1, and then as we get to Acts 17, we see now an individual who I think had been shaped. So Stephen's indictment, his aggressiveness led to a change. It led to a spread of that message. So when Paul saw firsthand what Stephen did, his energy, his aggressive nature at that moment, and it led to the persecution that he was helping to perpetuate, but he would have also seen over time how that persecution was a catalyst and a means for that spread. It actually, his job was to quash it, was to stamp it down, was to prevent this. Let's kill Stephen in the moment, let's stop this before it spreads, but their actions actually had the reverse consequence. So Paul witnessed Stephen's methods of how he spoke that day, how he witnessed his own response as somebody who was antagonistic to that message, and how he tried to stop it, and he saw which one was more effective. He who was aggressive towards the way of God, he who was aggressive in preaching an indictment to a people who were falling away, or he who was aggressive in trying to stop it through any means necessary, and which one prevailed. And he sat on both sides of that. So Paul's method of stopping the spread of this new faith failed. So when he was then converted and now adopted the role, now his job, as I can only imagine, he's coming before this group on Mars Hill. If I go back to that picture, as he would have walked up there after he was invited, but we know this is an antagonistic society towards it. They had no love for the true God, and as he's standing on this hill, once again standing with this large, iconic temple behind him that was revered, that was the center of society, religiously and civically and everything in between. And this group asks him about their God, and how could he not have remembered what he did to Stephen, but how also Stephen handled himself. And I think by his quoting, we know he obviously was thinking about it because he literally quotes Stephen. So I can only imagine how much that moment in Acts 7 shaped what he was doing and what he was thinking. And was he thinking in that moment, am I going to go through the same thing? Are they going to take me out and do to me what I did to that man? Because that power is there in these individuals. It's their city. I am a guest. But I also saw what happened when that man acted the way he did. And so he had an example to emulate and to adopt. And so to get to that moment, he would have had all these years of lead up to it. And think of how Paul then is in most of his other messages in other cities. Is he one who would shy away from an indictment, from calling a spade a spade? I mean, read 1 Corinthians. I don't think he was really afraid of saying things sometimes. How much was Paul shaped in that moment in Acts 7, standing before Stephen, likely as time went on feeling probably overcome with some grief from being involved in it. But I think he also saw how much it helped do what Stephen was trying to do, despite his best efforts. So I think when we read Acts 17 and see this moment here, what I tried to purvey last time is just how powerful I think that would have been, realizing the location of where he was. But I think it would be criminal to not understand, I think, then looking back, how much he was shaped all those years from that first moment we read about him in the end of Acts 17 and the beginning of chapter 8, that I think that moment shaped him in many ways. And he took that and saw how that was a win for the cause, though it was a loss for Stephen. And I think he patterned himself off that. And when he had a moment to stand on a hill like this, in front of a building like this, he didn't shy away. He knew the repercussions of what could happen, but he had an example in his head. He knew, you know what, it worked that first time. It had more power than I knew at the moment, and despite my efforts to stop it, I couldn't, and maybe it will have the same consequence this time.